This pile of firewood on my back porch has to go. Not just because it's ugly, but because it's a magnet for insects and rodents. And around here, that makes it prime hunting ground for snakes. I definitely don't want that on my back porch. So today we're building a firewood shed away from the house. But here's the problem. Most firewood sheds accidentally make a great home for rodents and snakes. So instead of just copying what everyone else does, we're going to make a couple design changes to address that problem without making the shed any harder to use. But before we call it done, there's one more thing I'll be doing to make this as uninviting to snakes as possible. For this build, I decided to go with some composite deck blocks from Fort Decking for a couple of reasons. Since my build site has tons of large rocks, the thought of trying to dig and set posts in concrete sounded like a losing battle. I also wanted to keep the floor of the firewood shed relatively low to the ground, and traditional concrete blocks are about 4 times taller than these composite blocks. So once I located the 4 corners of the shed and made sure everything was square, I set each block on a layer of compacted gravel. This makes getting them level a little easier and also allows water to flow underneath them without washing away the soil. I'm not sure if this is a pro or a con about these blocks, so I'll just call it an observation. But the opening for the 4x4s is a pretty tight fit. However, once the 4x4s were hammered onto the blocks, it was nice to be able to stand them up without having to worry about the fit being too loose and having one of those posts fall over and almost certainly knock me out. So the beauty of using this construction method is I don't have to rely on a perfectly level foundation before I can start building. My posts are at different levels because my grade is not completely flat. But the way I'll make the floor for my firewood shed level is by making sure that my rim joist is actually level. It'll be at different heights up on the post, but the floor of the shed will be nice and flat. So let's get started putting the rim joist on. Since I'm not making a ton of cuts for this project, I decided to knock everything out with the circular saw and speed square rather than setting up a miter saw. There's not much level ground around here, and honestly, getting a miter saw set up just to break down a handful of 16 footers seems like more trouble than it's worth. This way I can just slide boards off the end of my trailer and cut everything down to size. One of the most important things to stay on top of, especially at the beginning of this project, is keeping everything square and level. So before I screw the first rim joist in place, I grab a 4-foot level to check things. Since this build site isn't level by any stretch of the imagination, I have to use that to determine where the rim joists land on each post, and a couple trigger clamps make it easy to hold everything in position before screwing it in place. I'm making sure to use exterior grade construction screws here. For most of the framing, you'll want number 10 by 3.5 inch long screws. So for my build site, the ground was highest along the back of the shed, so that's why I installed that rim joist first. I then installed the shorter rim joists on the left and right sides, and finished things up with the rim joist along the front. Through this process, I also used the level to make sure the 4x4 posts at each corner were plumb before screwing the rim joists in place. If these posts weren't plumb, that could really throw off the roof later on. So even though this portion of the build requires a lot of checking and adjusting, it'll reward you later when it comes time to add the roof, decking, and slats around the sides. Now, depending on how large you plan on building your firewood shed, you may not need extra posts along the front and back. But since mine's 14 feet wide, I needed a little extra support to keep it from sagging in the middle. And if you're building one of these for yourself, I do have all the dimensions and post locations laid out and the plans linked below. At this point, I would ideally be installing the hardware cloth to underpin the shed and keep snakes and rodents out. But because Amazon's not going to get it to me for another 4 days, we're actually going to go ahead and install the joists. To install the joists, you could just nail them through the rim joists into the end of the boards. But because this is a firewood shed and it's going to be holding a ton of weight, we're actually going to be using some joist hangers. So I have 2 different styles of joist hangers I'm going to be using. These are your standard joist hangers, and I'll use those for the majority of the places. But then I have some concealed joist hangers, and these are kind of low profile. We're going to use these right where our center posts are because we're going to have 2 joists sandwiching that center post in place. So you might have been wondering why I didn't cut the 4x4 posts to length when I was setting them in the deck blocks, and here's why. At this point, I'm ready to attach the beams that'll support the rafters. And since this building site is anything but level, once those beams are set, there will be different amounts of each post extending above the beams. So rather than trying to calculate all of that ahead of time, I just cut each post flush after the framing for the roof is wrapped up. So just like we did for the rim joist, I'll be using some number 10 by 3.5 inch long screws to build the roof. Now, there are several different ways to frame a shed roof, and depending on the design you use, you may not need to cut the ends of your rafters at an angle. But for this project, my rafters are going to be done a bit differently because, in all honesty, framing this like a standard shed roof would be overkill. We'll be using metal roofing, which is significantly lighter than a shingled roof, and as a side benefit, it's a lot easier and faster to install. So for this roof, we're basically going to put rafters on both sides of the right, middle, and left pairs of 4x4 posts. Then we'll just toenail a couple of purlins between them to give the metal roofing a bit more support through its middle. You might hear people say, you should never use a reciprocating saw to cut posts like this. And usually, I would agree, because they don't cut as accurately as a circular saw. But for this job, I think it's the best tool, and since the metal roofing will completely cover the post anyways, no one will know if the cuts are a little sloppy. So instead of going to a big box store for my roofing and just grabbing whatever they have available, I actually found a local shop that makes metal roofing. And not only was this cheaper, but he made the panels to the exact length I needed while I waited. That means I didn't have to bother cutting them down to length, and I had a lot less waste. So for my project, the panels were about 15% cheaper, and he also included all the neoprene washers and screws I needed to install the panels, which saved me about another 30 bucks. Installing metal roofing is pretty straightforward, and especially for a project like this. But the one thing you got to make sure of is that your first panel is dead on, because if it's not, the whole roof is going to look crooked once you're finished. The last panel needed to be trimmed down just a bit, and you could do this with tin snips, but I really prefer these Steel Demon blades from Diablo. They'll throw a bunch of metal shavings while you're cutting, so safety glasses are a must, but it takes a fraction of the time and gives me a much straighter edge than I could get with tin snips. So with that last panel trimmed down, I just slide it into place and screw it down. Okay, so one thing I really want to do with this firewood shed is make it as inhospitable as possible to mice or other rodents, because that's just going to attract snakes. And where I live, timber rattlers and copperheads are fairly common. So the first thing we're going to do is make a physical barrier between the bottom of the shed and the ground. And to do that, we're going to use some hardware cloth that I picked up from Jeff Bezos. This stuff is 16 inches wide and 50 feet long, so it's just about the perfect amount for underpinning this firewood shed. So while I was setting up the camera, one thing that's cool about living in the woods is a pair of fawn just came out and got kind of close. So the process of installing the hardware cloth is pretty simple, and it's definitely made easier if you live in an area where there are not a ton of rocks. This site, I do have some larger rocks that I'm gonna have to contend with, but the idea is that to seal in this area, I wanna bury the hardware cloth a couple inches underneath the ground, and then I'll tamp it back down so the soil is nice and firm. So rather than trying to underpin the entire shed in one go, I'm gonna break it up into sections. I found that working between each set of 4x4 posts made this pretty manageable. And like I mentioned earlier, this would have been easier to install before the joists were added, because as it is, I have to notch around each joist. It's definitely doable, but it's just gonna take a bit longer. So to start off with and just get things tacked in place, I am securing the hardware cloth with some staples. These are fence staples, but they're also commonly used for installing hardware cloth. But a screw and a fender washer is going to do a lot better. I'm just using some 1.5 inch exterior grade screws. And the trick is that you want to make sure the head is big enough that it's not just going to get pulled through the center hole in the fender washer. So in an area like this is going to be a little bit more susceptible to a rodent trying to get in. So I want to make sure that the hardware cloth is pulled nice and tight up under here, right here as well. And also I'm going to secure it to the inside of my 4x4 post. And if you're curious about the exact screws and fender washers and whatnot I'm using, I'll have links in the description so that you can pick up the same ones if you want. When I got that put in, I felt that the hardware cloth pulled away just a little bit, so I'm gonna try and get it tucked under there. And actually I'm gonna go ahead and just cut this just a little bit so that way it can flex some more. Yep, that's feeling good. There are no gaps that I can feel under there. So we'll throw a screw underneath. Might have to get a little adapter for my drill though, so I can get in that tight spot. Yeah, I'm gonna have to go get my adapter. Okay, so this is a little 90-degree attachment that Kreg made. They came out with it a couple years ago. There are other versions of this by different brands, but it's gonna allow me to get right up under here without the bulk of the drill getting in the way. Alrighty, yep. So that's now up against there, nice and tight, and we'll pull that hardware cloth here and here. Since I had to cut it, it's now pulled away just a little. We can grab ourselves a little scrap and just kind of work it in there. And here again, I'll just go ahead and go with screws rather than some staples in this area. The trick is I just want to make sure that I'm threading it through all of those layers and not just one layer, because then obviously there's nothing that's going to hold it in place. All of that is going to be good and secure now. So I'll also go back and I'll put a couple of screws here at the bottom just to tighten all this up. If there's a vole or a weasel or something that's trying to push in here, they can actually pull those staples out. Okay, with the hardware cloth wrapped up, we are ready to install the decking and the slats around the back and the sides of the firewood shed. But instead of watching me cut all 40 fence pickets to size, which would be pretty boring, we're gonna go ahead and jump right into installing the decking and the side slats. I've got a couple tips I wanna show you that are gonna make this process faster and a bit more accurate. So let's get started. I got a handful of my deck boards cut, and for some reason I have a 2x4 sitting here with me, so I'll explain what I'm gonna do. Usually with a firewood shed, common advice is to leave a space between each one of the deck boards, but in keeping with the theme of wanting to keep rodents and especially snakes out from the bottom of this shed, I need to actually have the deck be completely closed up. So I don't want any gaps in between the deck boards, or at least as small as I can get by with. So I'm gonna chop this 2x4 up into some smaller sections and make a ledge around this 4x4. So that way my decking has some blocking to rest against here at the 4x4 and it's not gonna sag as much. All right, so with the deck boards cut to length, I am just going to line it up with the front of the firewood shed, and then I'm going to take a speed square and set it against my 4x4. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to do the same thing on the back. Since we all know that 4x4s are not actually 4x4, we have to measure 3.5 inches, and I'm going to continue that line up the side of my deck board. And then what we're going to do is we'll cut that out with the jigsaw. So before we get cutting, this is what it should look like. Alrighty, so the first one is notched. We'll just see, yeah, looks like that's gonna fit well. Now let's flip it over and cut the second one. I know when we were laying out for these notches, we had it here on the inside of the 4x4s, but we're actually gonna pull an Uno reverse card, flip it around, and slide it in from the outside. So now what that does is it gives us coverage on the outside of the 4x4 over the top of our rim joist. And since this is nice and flush with the inside of our 4x4, our next deck board will line up perfectly. One more thing I want to mention is the kind of screws that I'm using. These are exterior trim screws. Sometimes thinner materials like these fence pickets will split when you drive a screw through them. So I'm actually using some exterior grade trim screws. What's nice about these is the head is really small, but they still have good holding power. So I'm just going to make sure that my board is fully seated against the 4x4, and then I'm going to run some screws in. Now there is a little bit of an overhang of the deck board over the side of the rim joist, and it's going to be the same on the other side. You can cut that flush if you really want to. I don't really want to. I'm not that worried about it, so I'm just going to leave it. Also, you don't have to go crazy with the number of screws you put in. I'm just going every foot or so, and then throwing some more in right here where this cross member is. Now, if I could only work this fast in real life, that would be pretty awesome. We just finished installing the decking, and now we're going to move on to putting the slats on the back and then the side. So while we're installing the slats, we want to add some gap in between each one of those boards, and that's going to allow for airflow through the firewood shed, so that way the wood can season and dry out faster. Now you could get by with just using a tape measure. Measure the gap in between the boards, and honestly, that will get the job done. You will have space in between the boards, but it will likely not be consistent, and you might kind of hate yourself by the end of it. But the method I recommend is going to feel like a cheat code after you think about having to spend so much time with the tape measure, and that is to make a couple of spacers. These spacers are really easy to make, and you can make them from cutoffs from material you've already used for this project. You just want this width right here to be the same gap as the spacing you want for your slats. So let me show you how to use this jig. We're gonna get started installing the slats here along the back. Since our rim joist was nice and level, we should in theory be able to just set this first slat against our decking and then screw it into place. It'd be nice to have this end right here flush with the side of our 4x4, and then we want to make sure that it's roughly centered on the middle of our 4x4 center post here. So just for giggles, we're going to go ahead and put a level on here and make sure it doesn't need to be adjusted. That is still dead in the middle. So we're going to get this first one screwed in, and then the fun will really start happening because we'll be ready to use our spacers. I guess I should warn you, the only downside to these tiny trim screws is the bit can sometimes really get stripped out. Usually they'll kind of start twisting. It still works just fine, but it makes you feel like an absolute newbie because all you hear is the screw head just rattling as you're trying to drive them in. One spacer here, and it's starting to rain, so we might have to move the camera and, improvise a little bit. There we go. So we've got our board evenly spaced, and now just need to slide it. So again, it's flush with the end of our 4x4, and we're ready to screw it in. Well, that's got the slats all wrapped up, and I mentioned earlier how those trim screws can sometimes be a little bit finicky. Well, I'm gonna make a correction to that. I just opened up a new box of the Power Pro screws. These are the screws that I use for practically all of my construction projects. It seems like the star pattern in the top of these screws is just a little bit deeper. I didn't spin the bit on a single one of these screws, but I do like their screws, and I just dropped my safety glasses, so I guess let's get on to adding some detail to the front of this shed. There are a couple things you can do to make the process of putting these pieces in a lot easier, and one of them is going ahead and starting your screws here at the bottom where it's going to attach to the other 4x4, and the other one is to use a clamp and a ladder. That is really squishy right now. We had a ton of rain last night. Let's see how it looks. Yeah, looks pretty good. So out of the gate, at a minimum, I wanted to get my firewood off the back porch, but I also wanted to make this firewood shed less inviting to rodents and especially snakes. So we made some design choices like closing in the bottom with hardware cloth and not leaving any gaps between the deck boards. But there's one more thing I'm gonna throw at this, and that is snake repellent. There are some homemade options you can make from simple ingredients you probably already have around your house. But the only problem with those mixtures is they don't stick around very long, especially once it's rained. And since I'm not looking for another constant task on my to-do list, I grabbed a bag of this stuff that my neighbor recommended. He's had really good results with it, and according to the bag, an application can last about 3 months. So we're gonna give it a try. Now, a heavy rain might mean that I still need to reapply this, but I'm treating this repellent as an extra layer of defense because the main goal was to build a shed that's less inviting to rodents and snakes by design, rather than relying on chemical deterrents. Since firewood season is just around the corner, I have plans available linked in the description below so that you can build a firewood shed like this for your property. That's a pretty straightforward project, but what's great is that the plans take out all the guesswork so you can jump right into building. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next project.